You don't even know how to change a tire," one of the mechanics scoffed, drawing nervous laughter from his colleagues. The old man slowly raised his gaze, steady and unshaken. The pilot, impatient, kicked the ground. "If nobody fixes this, I'll lose the race." The metallic clang of falling tools echoed in the garage as they all looked at each other, helpless. In the silence that followed, the old man's weathered eyes seemed to hold the answer no one dared to ask for. "Before we dive into the story, leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us what city you're watching from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart." The Riverside Speedway's pit row buzzed with the electric tension that only championship day could bring. The scent of high-octane fuel mixed with hot rubber and metal polish hung thick in the Nevada air, while loudspeakers crackled with last-minute announcements. Beneath the main grandstand, crews scrambled through narrow garage bays in a choreographed chaos of final preparations. Socket wrenches clinked against concrete, air compressors hissed their mechanical breath, and engines roared to life only to sputter back into silence. In Garage Bay 17, a sleek red Yamaha sat motionless, its fairings removed like surgical incisions, exposing the mechanical heart beneath. 3 crew members huddled around the machine, their matching blue team shirts already stained with sweat and frustration. The youngest, barely 22, with sandy hair and calloused hands, repeatedly cranked the starter while shaking his head. "It's not the fuel injection, Marcus," he called out to the crew chief, a stocky man with graying temples who paced behind him. "I've checked it 6 times. Marcus Rodriguez wiped his face with a shop rag, leaving streaks of grease across his weathered cheek. 23 years in professional motorcycle racing had taught him to read mechanical problems like a doctor reads symptoms. But this one defied every diagnostic trick in his arsenal. The bike would fire up beautifully for 30 seconds, purr like a contented cat, then suddenly stumble and die, as if someone had flipped a switch. "Danny, check the ECU connections again," Marcus ordered, though he knew they'd already been over every wire 3 times. "Tyler, pull the spark plugs. Maybe we're missing something." Single quotes, Tyler Brennan, the team's star rider, stood against the far wall with his arms crossed, his lean frame rigid with contained anxiety. At 26, he'd clawed his way up from amateur dirt tracks to the professional circuit through pure determination and an almost reckless fearlessness on 2 wheels. This championship race represented everything he'd sacrificed for family dinners missed, relationships ended, every spare dollar poured into racing fees and equipment. Now, with less than an hour before the green flag, his dreams sat broken in front of him. "This is unbelievable," Tyler muttered, running his fingers through his dark hair. 3 months of preparation, and we're going to miss the biggest race of the season because of some ghost problem. Near the entrance to the garage, almost unnoticed among the organized chaos, stood an elderly man in faded blue jeans and a plain gray work shirt. His silver hair was neatly combed, but showed the slight dishevelment of a man who'd worked with his hands all his life. Deep lines carved his face like tributaries of experience, and his pale blue eyes held the patient stillness of someone who had learned to see beyond the surface of things. Robert "Bobby" Sullivan had arrived at the Speedway that morning, not as crew, competitor, or official, but simply as a spectator, with a general admission ticket folded in his shirt pocket. At 71, he had been drawn back to the sounds and smells of racing by something he couldn't quite name, perhaps nostalgia, perhaps a longing for the world he'd once known so intimately. He'd wandered from the grandstands to the pit area, following the familiar symphony of mechanical preparation. Now he stood quietly at the edge of Garage 17, watching the young crew struggle with a problem he'd encountered dozens of times in his 40-year career as a master mechanic. His trained ear had already diagnosed the issue from 20 feet away, an intermittent ground fault in the ignition system, probably caused by a wire that had chafed against the frame. Simple to fix if you knew where to look, nearly impossible to find if you didn't. But Bobby said nothing. His work boots, cracked with age but well-maintained, remained planted on the concrete floor. His hands, scarred from decades of sharp metal and hot engines, stayed clasped behind his back. Long experience had taught him that offering unwanted advice was the fastest way to earn hostility, especially from young professionals who viewed their expertise as a badge of honor. "Maybe it's the fuel pump," suggested Danny, the youngest mechanic, desperation creeping into his voice. "We already tested fuel pressure," Marcus snapped, then immediately softened his tone. "Sorry, kid. I know you're trying." The garage's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made everyone look older and more tired than they were. On the wall, a large clock with red digits counted down the minutes until race time, each second falling away like hope itself. The sound echoed off the metal walls, tick, tick, ticking, metronome keeping time with their rising panic. Tyler pushed away from the wall and approached his bike, kneeling beside the exposed engine. "There has to be something. Some little thing we're missing." His voice carried the strain of a man watching his future slip away. "I've been racing this bike for 2 seasons. She's never let me down like this." Bobby observed the young rider's posture. The way Tyler's shoulders hunched with defeat, how his hands trembled slightly as he touched the machine. In that moment, the old mechanic saw himself 40 years younger, facing his own mechanical crises at a dirt track in Indiana, when everything he'd worked for hung in the balance. The memory stirred something deep in his chest. A recognition of dreams deferred and the cruel indifference of timing. The pit lane beyond the garage door, filled with the rumble of other teams firing up their machines for warm-up laps. Each successful engine start felt like another nail in Tyler's championship coffin. Other riders, other crews, other dreams moving forward, while theirs remained frozen in frustration. "How much time?" Tyler asked without looking up. Marcus checked his watch. 47 minutes to start engines. A mechanic from the neighboring garage poked his head through the doorway. "You guys need anything? Parts? Tools? Unless you've got a miracle in your toolbox, we're good," Marcus replied with forced humor that fooled no one. The neighbor shrugged sympathetically and disappeared, leaving them alone with their silent motorcycle and dwindling options. In the distance, the track announcer's voice boomed across the speedway, introducing sponsors and building excitement for a race that Tyler might not be able to run. Bobby shifted his weight slightly, the small movement causing Tyler to glance in his direction for the first time. Their eyes met briefly, the desperate gaze of youth meeting the patient wisdom of age. For a moment, something passed between them, an unspoken understanding that transcended their vastly different circumstances. Then Tyler looked away, returning his attention to the mechanical puzzle before him. The old man remained where he stood, a silent witness to frustration and dreams deferred. His presence was so unobtrusive that the crew had almost forgotten he existed, yet something about his stillness suggested depths that none of them could imagine. In his weathered hands lay skills that could solve their problem in minutes, but those hands remained clasped behind his back, waiting for an invitation that seemed unlikely to come. The clock continued its relentless countdown, marking the space between hope and heartbreak with mechanical precision. The tension in Garage 17 thickened like smoke from burning oil as Marcus Rodriguez gathered his crew for what felt like a final strategy session. The three mechanics, Danny, a freckled redhead from Ohio, Jake, a veteran wrench with tattooed forearms, and Steve, the electronics specialist with thick-rimmed glasses, formed a tight circle around their crew chief, their faces etched with the particular strain that comes from knowing you're running out of options. "All right, listen up," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of 2 decades spent managing racing teams. "We're going to approach this systematically. Jake, I want you to pull the entire wiring harness from the ignition control unit. Danny, you're on fuel system check every fitting, every line, every filter. Steve, run full diagnostics on all the sensors one more time." Tyler paced behind them like a caged animal, his leather racing boots clicking against the concrete with each agitated step. The sound created its own rhythm, counterpoint to the distant roar of engines being tested on other parts of the speedway. His championship leathers hung on a nearby hook. The number 47, embroidered in bold silver thread, the number he'd chosen to honor his late grandfather, who'd taught him to ride on an old dirt bike behind their family farm in Kentucky. "This doesn't make sense," Tyler said, addressing no one in particular. "The bike ran perfect in practice yesterday, perfect in qualifying. Now, 8 hours later, it won't hold idle for more than 30 seconds. Bobby Sullivan continued his quiet observation from the garage entrance, noting details that the frustrated crew had missed. The way the engine stumbled wasn't random, it followed a pattern, occurring roughly every 27 to 35 seconds after startup. His experienced ear also caught a subtle change in the electrical hum from the bike's systems, a barely perceptible shift that suggested voltage fluctuation. He'd seen this exact problem in 1987 at Daytona, when a factory Kawasaki team had faced an identical mystery. The solution had been embarrassingly simple. Once discovered, a single wire in the main harness had worn through its insulation where it passed over a sharp edge of the frame. Every vibration would cause an intermittent short to ground, creating a fault code that the primitive electronics of that era couldn't properly diagnose. But Bobby remained silent, his presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. His gray work shirt, though clean, showed the permanent stains that marked a lifetime of honest labor. His boots, while sturdy, lacked the expensive racing team logos that adorned the footwear of the younger crew members. To them, he was just another curious spectator who'd wandered too close to the action. The contrast between worlds couldn't have been sharper. The Brennan racing team represented the modern face of professional motorsports, young, technically educated, equipped with the latest diagnostic equipment, and backed by corporate sponsors whose logos decorated every surface of their operation. Their tools gleamed with factory finishes, their uniforms coordinated in team colors, and their approach to problem-solving relied heavily on computer diagnostics and manufacturer technical support. Bobby represented something entirely different, an era when mechanical knowledge was earned through apprenticeship and intuition, when problems were solved through experience rather than algorithms, and when the relationship between man and machine was as much art as science. His tools, if he'd had them, would have shown the wear patterns of constant use. His knowledge lived not in manuals or databases, but in the calluses on his hands and the memory of 10,000 repairs. "Try starting her again," Marcus ordered. Danny hit the starter button, and the Yamaha roared to life with the crisp, powerful voice that had made Tyler competitive all season. For 30 seconds, It purred with mechanical perfection, each cylinder firing in precise harmony. Then, as if controlled by an invisible switch, the engine stumbled, coughed, and died. Son of a... Jake caught himself before completing the profanity, glancing around the garage with embarrassment. Sorry, coach. This is just driving me crazy. I know, buddy. We're all feeling it. Steve pushed his glasses up his nose and scrolled through the diagnostic readings on his tablet computer. The ACU isn't throwing any fault codes. Everything looks normal right up until the moment it dies. It's like the bike forgets how to run for no reason. Tyler stopped pacing and approached his machine. Kneeling beside the exposed engine with the reverence of a rider who understood that this collection of metal and electronics represented not just transportation, but the vehicle for his deepest aspirations. He placed his hand on the warm cylinder head, feeling the residual heat from their repeated startup attempts. "Talk to me, girl," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the pit lane. "What are you trying to tell me?" From his position near the entrance, Bobby heard those words and felt his chest tighten with recognition. He remembered speaking similar phrases to stubborn machines, treating them not as mere objects, but as partners in a shared endeavor. That relationship, the bond between craftsman and creation, was something that transcended generations and connected all who truly understood the art of making things work. A commotion outside drew their attention as Derek Castellano, owner of the rival Redline racing team, appeared in the doorway, flanked by two of his crew members. Derek was everything Tyler wasn't: wealthy, connected, blessed with family money that had purchased the best equipment and most experienced personnel that motorsports could offer. His racing suit was custom-tailored Italian leather, his helmet adorned with gold leaf graphics. And his approach to racing was as much about image as performance. "Having some technical difficulties, Marcus?" Derek asked with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His dark hair was perfectly styled, despite the heat of the garage area, and his pristine team shirt looked like it had just come from the laundry. "Nothing we can't handle," Marcus replied evenly, though his jaw tightened at the interruption. Derek's gaze swept the garage, taking in the scattered tools, the frustrated faces, and the silent motorcycle. "That's a shame. Tyler's been running strong all season. Would hate to see him miss the championship race over a mechanical." "We'll be on the grid," Tyler said, rising to face his rival. The two riders were similar in age, but vastly different in bearing. Tyler lean and intense, Derek confident and casual. "Of course you will," Derek agreed, his tone suggesting exactly the opposite. "Well, don't let me keep you from your work. I'm sure you'll figure it out." As Derek and his entourage departed, their laughter echoing from the corridor, the atmosphere in Garage 17 grew even more charged with frustration and wounded pride. The contrast between the two teams was obvious to everyone, one blessed with resources and confidence, the other scrambling to solve a mystery that threatened to end their season. Bobby watched this interaction with interest, recognizing the dynamics at play. In his long career, he'd seen countless examples of privilege versus perseverance, of money versus skill, of arrogance versus determination. The outcome wasn't always predictable, but the tension was universal. 39 minutes, Marcus announced, checking his watch again. The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder now, each second a hammer blow against their hopes. In the distance, the public address announcer began introducing the day's competitors, his voice carrying across the speedway with practiced enthusiasm. Other teams were completing their final preparations, confident in their machinery and ready to compete for the championship title. Bobby shifted his stance slightly, his movement causing several members of the crew to glance in his direction. For the first time, Danny looked directly at him, with a mixture of curiosity and mild annoyance. "You need something, Pops?" Danny asked, his tone not unkind but clearly suggesting that Bobby's presence was unnecessary. The question hung in the air like exhaust from a cold engine, heavy with assumption and dismissal. Bobby met the young man's eyes steadily, seeing not hostility but desperation disguised as authority. It was a look he'd encountered many times over the years, the expression of youth protecting its territory, even when that territory was crumbling. "Just watching," Bobby replied quietly, his voice carrying the gentle authority of experience without confrontation. "Hope you'll get us sorted out." Danny nodded curtly and returned to his work, effectively dismissing the old man from consideration. But Bobby remained where he stood, patient as stone, carrying within his silence the solution they desperately needed. The engine of change was about to turn over, though none of them knew it yet. 28 minutes remained on the wall clock when Marcus Rodriguez finally allowed the word that had been lurking in everyone's mind to escape his lips. Scratch. The simple word fell into the garage like a dropped wrench, clanging against the concrete floor of their collective hopes. Tyler Brennan felt it hit his chest with physical force, the sound of a dream dissolving into the mechanical chaos surrounding them. "Coach, we can't," Danny started to protest, his young face flushed with the heat of the garage and the fever of desperation. "Look around, kid," Marcus interrupted, gesturing toward the disassembled motorcycle that had consumed their morning. "We've pulled half this bike apart, and we're no closer to an answer than we were 2 hours ago. The race officials need our entry confirmation in 30 minutes, and we don't have a running motorcycle." Jake, the veteran mechanic, with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails, looked up from the wiring harness he'd been tracing for the third time. "Marcus, I've never seen you give up on anything. This ain't like you." "I'm not giving up," Marcus replied, though the weariness in his voice suggested otherwise. "I'm being realistic. We can't put Tyler on the grid with a bike that might die in the middle of turn 3 at 90 miles per hour. That's not racing, that's suicide." Tyler stood motionless beside his machine, staring at the exposed engine as if he could will it to reveal its secrets through pure intensity of focus. His championship leathers hung nearby like a shed skin, the dreams they represented now seeming as distant as childhood fantasies. 2 years of preparation, countless hours of practice. Every spare dollar invested in equipment and travel, all of it balanced on the edge of meaninglessness. Bobby Sullivan observed this moment of crisis from his position near the garage entrance, feeling the weight of their frustrations settle over the space like humidity before a storm. His weathered hands, still clasped behind his back, ached with the restraint of holding back knowledge that could change everything. 47 years of fixing the unfixable had taught him that sometimes the hardest part wasn't solving the problem, with being allowed to try. The old mechanic's trained eye continued to catalogue details that the younger crew had missed in their urgency. The pattern of oil stains on the floor beneath the bike, the way the electrical connections had been hastily reconnected during their troubleshooting attempts, the subtle signs that spoke of a system under stress, fighting against itself in ways that sophisticated diagnostics couldn't detect. Steve, the electronics specialist, saved his diagnostic file and powered down his tablet with the finality of a funeral director closing a coffin. "I've run every test in the system twice. According to the computer, everything's perfect. The bike should run flawlessly, but it doesn't," Tyler said quietly, his voice hollow with disappointment. "But it doesn't," Steve agreed. The sounds of the speedway filtered into their garage engines, warming up in neighboring bays. The distant announcement of driver introductions. The mechanical symphony of a racing facility in full operation. Each sound felt like a reminder of what they were about to lose, a chorus of opportunity that would continue without them. Marcus began the grim process of gathering tools and closing up their operation. Jake, start loading the truck. Danny, you and Steve get the bike ready for transport. We'll take her back to the shop and figure this out for next season. Next season? Tyler's voice cracked slightly on the words. Marcus, I'm 26 years old. How many more chances do you think I'm going to get? The sponsors are already asking questions about results. If we scratch from the championship race, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the garage understood the mathematics of professional racing. Results attracted money. Money bought competitive equipment, and equipment enabled results. Break that cycle, and careers ended faster than they'd begun. For a rider without family wealth or corporate backing, missing the championship race wasn't just a disappointment, it was potentially the end of everything. Bobby listened to this exchange with the deep understanding of a man who'd witnessed countless dreams balanced on the edge of mechanical failure. In his 4 decades as a master mechanic, he'd seen careers rise and fall based on something as simple as a loose wire or a miscalibrated sensor. The difference between success and failure in racing was often measured not in seconds, but in thousandths of seconds, margins so small that the tiniest mechanical imperfection could spell disaster. You know, Tyler said suddenly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge of desperate inspiration. Maybe we should just run it anyway. Take our chances. Absolutely not, Marcus replied immediately, his crew chief authority cutting through Tyler's desperation like a blade. I won't put you on that track with equipment I don't trust. Period. End of discussion. It's my career, my decision. It's my race team, and my responsibility is to keep you alive. The answer is no. The argument that followed was brief but intense, carried out in the clipped, professional tones of men who'd worked together long enough to understand each other's limits. Tyler pressed with the fervor of youth and ambition. Marcus held firm with the authority of experience and genuine concern for his riders' safety. In the end, experience won, as it usually did in the dangerous world of professional racing. Bobby watched this exchange with particular interest, recognizing the dynamics at play. The crew chief's refusal wasn't born of timidity, but of hard-earned wisdom. He'd probably seen riders injured or worse because teams had gambled with uncertain equipment. In racing, as in many dangerous professions, there were risks worth taking and risks that were simply foolish. The art lay in knowing the difference. As the argument wound down and the reality of their situation settled over the garage like dust from a collapsed building, Bobby found himself facing a familiar crossroads. He could continue to stand silently, respecting their professional territory and their obvious desire to handle the problem themselves, or he could violate the unspoken protocol that had kept him invisible and offer assistance that might save their championship hopes. The decision crystallized when he noticed Tyler's hands. The young rider had knelt beside his motorcycle again, placing his palms flat against the warm metal of the fuel tank in a gesture that spoke of genuine love for the machine and the sport it represented. It was the same gesture Bobby had made countless times over the years. The instinctive touch of someone who understood that racing motorcycles were more than mere transportation. They were partners in the pursuit of something transcendent. "Excuse me," Bobby said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the ambient noise of the pit area. The simple words seemed to surprise everyone in the garage, as if they'd forgotten he existed. 4 pairs of eyes turned toward him, with expressions ranging from mild curiosity to outright annoyance. He represented an interruption they didn't need, another variable in an equation that was already too complex. "Yeah," Marcus replied, his tone polite, but clearly indicating that whatever Bobby had to say needed to be brief. Bobby stepped forward slightly, his movement careful and non-threatening. "I couldn't help but notice your problem. I've been listening to that engine for the past couple hours." Danny let out a short laugh that wasn't entirely pleasant. "Great. Another expert. You a mechanic? Old-timer?" The question hung in the air between them. Simple on the surface, but loaded with assumptions about age, appearance, and capability. Bobby considered his answer carefully, understanding that how he responded would determine whether they listened to what came next or dismissed him entirely. "I've worked on a few engines in my time," he said simply, the understatement so profound it bordered on comedy. Jake wiped his hands on a shop rag and studied the old man with professional curiosity. "What do you think you hear that we don't?" It was a fair question, asked without hostility, but with the skepticism of a craftsman who had heard plenty of unsolicited advice from well-meaning amateurs over the years. Bobby appreciated the directness. It was the language of mechanics everywhere, cutting through pleasantries to focus on the work at hand. "Intermittent ground fault," Bobby said without hesitation. "Somewhere in the main harness where it passes over the frame. Creates a short circuit every 30 seconds or so until the system resets itself." The garage fell silent, except for the ambient sounds filtering in from the pit lane. Steve pushed his glasses up his nose and stared at Bobby with newfound interest. "That's ... actually possible. My diagnostics wouldn't catch an intermittent ground fault if it was clearing itself before the next system scan. Where would you look?" Marcus asked, his tone shifting from polite dismissal to cautious interest. Bobby's answer would determine everything that followed. Success would validate his presence and open the door to saving their championship hopes. Failure would confirm their assumptions about helpful strangers and leave Tyler's dreams broken on the garage floor. The weight of that moment settled over all of them as Bobby Sullivan prepared to step out of the shadows and back into the world he'd once commanded. Bobby Sullivan moved toward the motorcycle with the deliberate pace of a man who'd learned that haste was the enemy of precision. His worn work boots made soft scraping sounds against the concrete floor, a rhythm that somehow matched the measured beating of his heart as he approached the machine that had confounded an entire professional crew. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked, though he was already kneeling beside the Yamaha's exposed frame. Marcus Rodriguez found himself nodding before he'd consciously decided to trust this stranger. Something in the old man's manner, the way he approached the motorcycle, the careful confidence of his movements suggested knowledge that went deeper than casual familiarity. Bobby's weathered hands hovered over the bike's main wiring harness, not touching yet, but following the path of the cables with the practiced eye of someone who understood that every wire had a story to tell. His fingers traced the air above the electrical connections, mapping the system through decades of accumulated knowledge. "Here," he said, pointing to a section where the harness crossed over a sharp edge of the aluminum frame. "This is where she's giving you trouble." Danny, Jake, and Steve crowded closer, their earlier skepticism replaced by curiosity. The spot, Bobby indicated, looked identical to dozens of other places where wires passed over metal. Protected by the same rubber grommets and tape wrapping, that covered the entire system. "I don't see anything," Danny said, peering closely at the connection. "That's the problem with intermittent faults," Bobby replied, his voice carrying the patient tone of a teacher explaining a complex concept. "They don't always show themselves when you're looking. But if you know what to listen for, ... single quotes." He gestured toward Tyler. "Fire her up again." Tyler glanced at Marcus, who nodded consent. The starter engaged, and once again the Yamaha roared to life with crisp, powerful authority. The sound filled the garage with mechanical music, the precise harmony of pistons, valves, and combustion that represented the heart of motorcycle racing. Bobby closed his eyes and tilted his head slightly, like a conductor listening for a discordant note in an orchestra. His face showed the intense concentration of someone accessing information that existed beyond the realm of digital diagnostics and computer analysis. "There," he said after 20 seconds, opening his eyes. "Do you hear that slight change in the electrical hum? Right, ... about ... now." As if on cue, the engine stumbled and died, exactly as it had dozens of times that morning. But now, primed by Bobby's observation, the crew members heard what they'd been missing, a subtle shift in the electrical system's background. Noise just before the failure occurred. "I'll be damned," Jake whispered. "How did we miss that?" "Because you were listening with your eyes instead of your ears," Bobby replied without condescension. "Modern diagnostics are amazing tools, but sometimes the machine tells you what's wrong if you know how to listen." Steve pushed his glasses up again, his analytical mind processing this new information. "An intermittent ground fault would explain why my equipment isn't catching it. The system resets itself between diagnostic cycles." Bobby nodded approvingly. "Smart young man. The wire's probably worn through its insulation where it rubs against that frame edge. Every time the engine vibrates, it makes contact and creates a short circuit. The ECU interprets this as a system failure and shuts down the engine to prevent damage." Marcus stepped closer, his crew chief instincts engaging despite his lingering uncertainty about accepting help from a stranger. "Can you show us where to look?" "I can do better than that," Bobby said, then paused, seeming to consider something. "If you're willing to let me." The question created a moment of suspended tension in the garage. Accepting help meant admitting their limitations, but rejecting it might cost them their championship opportunity. Tyler watched this exchange with the desperate attention of someone whose future hung in the balance. "What exactly are you proposing?" Marcus asked. Bobby's answer came without hesitation. "Give me 10 minutes and a basic toolkit. If I'm wrong about the diagnosis, you've lost nothing but a few minutes. If I'm right, you'll be on the grid in time for the race." The silence that followed stretched like the pause between lightning and thunder, heavy with possibility and risk. Finally, Tyler spoke from beside his motorcycle, his voice carrying the weight of dreams deferred too long. "Do it." Marcus looked at his rider, then at his crew, then back at the elderly stranger who'd appeared in their garage like an answer to a prayer they hadn't known they were praying. The decision went against every protocol he'd learned in his professional career. But something about Bobby's quiet confidence suggested knowledge that transcended normal protocols. "Jake, get him whatever tools he needs," Marcus said finally. Bobby accepted a basic toolkit with the reverence of a musician handling a fine instrument, his hands marked by decades of honest labor. Selected a small flashlight and a pair of needle-nose pliers with the certainty of someone who'd made these choices thousands of times before. "This might look like magic to you," he said as he began carefully pulling back the protective covering on the wiring harness. but it's really just experience. 47 years of fixing things that didn't want to be fixed. The revelation of his experience level sent a ripple of recognition through the crew. 47 years meant this man had been working on engines since before some of them were born, accumulating knowledge through an era when mechanical understanding was earned through apprenticeship and intuition, rather than computer diagnostics and technical manuals. Bobby worked with methodical precision, his movements economical and purposeful. Where the younger mechanics had pulled components apart with the urgency of their situation, he approached the task like a surgeon, understanding that haste was the enemy of accuracy when dealing with complex systems. "There she is," he said, after 3 minutes of careful examination. His flashlight illuminated a section of wire that looked identical to every other section, except for a tiny spot where the insulation had worn through to expose bare copper. The damage was so small it would have been invisible without direct illumination and the knowledge of exactly where to look. "Son of a gun," Danny breathed, leaning in to see what Bobby had discovered. "That little thing has been driving us crazy all morning." "Little things have big consequences in racing," Bobby replied, already reaching for electrical tape from Jake's toolkit. "Sometimes the difference between winning and losing comes down to something smaller than a grain of rice." The repair itself took less than 5 minutes, cleaning the damaged section, wrapping it with fresh insulation, and rerouting the wire to eliminate contact with the frame. Bobby worked with the fluid efficiency of someone whose hands knew their business, each movement precise and confident. "Try her now," he said, stepping back from the motorcycle. Tyler approached the starter with a mixture of hope and skepticism that had become familiar over the course of the morning. The engine fired immediately, settling into the smooth, powerful idle that had been missing for hours. 30 seconds pass, then 60. The Yamaha continued to run with mechanical perfection, its voice steady and strong. "Well, I'll be damned," Marcus said, his voice filled with wonder and a growing respect for the old man who'd solved their unsolvable problem. The transformation in the garage was immediate and palpable. Frustrated tension gave way to relieved energy as the crew began reassembling the components they'd removed during their diagnostic marathon. Tools that had been scattered in desperation were organized with purpose. The clock on the wall, which had been their enemy, suddenly became their ally as they realized they would make the grid after all. But even as the garage filled with renewed activity and hope, Bobby Sullivan remained apart from the celebration. A quiet figure who'd emerged from invisibility just long enough to change everything before preparing to fade back into the shadows. His work was done, the problem solved, but the story was far from over. Tyler approached him as the crew continued their reassembly work, extending a hand that still trembled slightly with relief and adrenaline. "I don't know how to thank you," Tyler said. "You saved our season. Hell, you probably saved my career." Bobby accepted the handshake with the firm grip of a man who'd spent his life working with his hands. But his expression remained modest, almost embarrassed by the gratitude. "Just glad I could help," he said simply. "Good luck in the race." As Bobby turned to leave, something in Marcus Rodriguez's experienced eye caught a detail that made him pause. The way the old man moved around mechanical equipment, the confidence of his touch, the intuitive understanding he'd displayed. These weren't the characteristics of someone who'd simply worked on a few engines. They were the marks of true mastery, the kind that came only from a lifetime spent at the very highest levels of the craft. "Wait," Marcus called out as Bobby reached the garage entrance. "I never got your name." Bobby paused, turning back with a slight smile that carried depths the crew was only beginning to suspect. "Bobby Sullivan," he said. "And don't worry, Your boys are going to do just fine out there." The name meant nothing to the younger crew members, but Marcus Rodriguez felt a spark of recognition that would grow into amazement over the next few hours. Somewhere in the back of his memory, filed away with 1,000 other pieces of racing history, that name connected to something significant. But for now, there was a race to prepare for, and the clock was ticking toward the most important 30 minutes of Tyler Brennan's career. Marcus Rodriguez stood frozen in the garage entrance, watching Bobby Sullivan's retreating figure disappear into the crowd of spectators and crew members populating the pit lane. The name echoed in his mind like the reverberations of a powerful engine, triggering memories that seemed to bubble up from depths he'd forgotten he possessed. "Bobby Sullivan," he repeated quietly, tasting the syllables as if they might reveal their secrets. Behind him, the Brennan racing crew continued their frantic reassembly of Tyler's motorcycle, their movements sharp with the efficiency of professionals who'd suddenly been granted a reprieve from disaster. Danny reinstalled the fairings with practiced precision, while Jake and Steve ran final system checks. But Marcus remained motionless, his mind racing backward through decades of racing history. "Coach Tay, you okay?" Tyler called from beside his now purring Yamaha. "We've got 18 minutes to get this bike to the grid." Marcus nodded absently, still staring down the pit lane where the old man had vanished. "Bobby Sullivan," he said again, the name gaining weight with each repetition. "Why does that name sound so familiar?" "Never heard it before today," Danny replied, tightening the last fairing bolt. "But whoever he is, the old guy sure knows his way around an engine." "Old guy," Marcus repeated, something crystallizing in his memory like sugar forming around a string. "Jesus Christ." The profanity came out as a whisper, barely audible over the mechanical symphony of the pit area, but it carried the weight of profound realization. Marcus pulled out his smartphone and began typing rapidly, his thick fingers dancing across the screen with surprising agility. "What are you looking for?" Steve asked, glancing up from his diagnostic tablet. "Robert Sullivan," Marcus said, scrolling through search results. "Bobby Sullivan. Master mechanic. Racing legend. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God." The crew gathered around Marcus as his search yielded results that transformed their understanding of the morning's events. The first image that appeared showed a younger man with familiar pale blue eyes and the same steady bearing they'd witnessed, standing beside a gleaming motorcycle in Victory Lane at Daytona International Speedway. "Robert Bobby Sullivan," Marcus read aloud, his voice filled with growing amazement, widely considered one of the most gifted motorcycle mechanics in professional racing history. During his 47-year career, Sullivan served as crew chief and master mechanic for teams that won 12 national championships and 43 individual races. Tyler leaned closer to look at the phone screen, his eyes widening as he processed the information. "That's him. That's really him." Marcus continued reading, his voice gaining momentum with each incredible detail. Sullivan was particularly renowned for his ability to diagnose complex mechanical problems that defeated other professionals. His intuitive understanding of motorcycle engines became legendary throughout the racing community, earning him the nickname the Engine Whisperer. Danny let out a low whistle. "The Engine Whisperer, and he just fixed our bike." Sullivan retired from professional racing in 2001, Marcus continued, following the death of his longtime friend and riding partner, Michael Clutch Henderson, in a practice accident at Road America. He disappeared from the racing community entirely and was believed to be living quietly somewhere in the western United States. The garage fell silent as the full weight of what they'd experienced settled over them. The helpful stranger who'd solved their impossible problem wasn't just any experienced mechanic. He was living racing legend. A master craftsman whose reputation had been built over nearly half a century of excellence at the highest levels of professional motorsports. "We didn't even recognize him," Jake said, his voice heavy with something approaching shame. "A legend walked into our garage, and we treated him like some random old guy who didn't know what he was talking about." Tyler sank onto a nearby tool cart, overwhelmed by the magnitude of their near miss with history. "I almost dismissed him completely. If Danny hadn't asked him what he thought he heard, ... Don't beat yourself up," Marcus said, though his own voice carried regret. "I should have recognized the name immediately. Bobby Sullivan was famous in racing circles 20 years ago. Every crew chief worth his salt knew who he was." Steve pushed his glasses up his nose, a nervous habit that seemed more pronounced now. "Why did he retire?" "The article mentions an accident. But ... single quotes." Marcus nodded grimly. "Clutch Henderson was more than Bobby's riding partner. They were best friends. Started racing together in the 70s, built their careers side by side. When Clutch died in that practice crash, Bobby just ... disappeared, sold his shop, liquidated everything, and vanished from the racing world entirely. Nobody knew where he went or what happened to him. The pieces of Bobby Sullivan's story began to form a picture of loss and withdrawal that explained his presence in their garage that morning. A master craftsman, driven from his calling by grief, returning after more than 2 decades to witness the sport that had once defined his existence. The fact that he'd chosen to help them, to emerge from his self-imposed exile to solve their mechanical crises, took on profound significance. "We have to find him," Tyler said suddenly, his voice filled with determination. "We have to thank him properly. Tell him we know who he is." Marcus checked his watch and shook his head. 15 minutes to grid. "We need to get this bike to tech inspection and get you suited up. Maybe after the race." The next quarter hour passed in a blur of final preparations and rushed movement through the Speedway's pre-race procedures. Kyler's Yamaha passed technical inspection without incident. The mysterious engine problem that had threatened their championship hopes, now nothing more than a memory, secured by electrical tape and the wisdom of experience. As Tyler suited up in his racing leathers and prepared for the most important race of his career, he found his thoughts divided between the upcoming competition and the enigmatic figure who'd made it possible. Somewhere in the grandstands, or perhaps he already departed from the Speedway entirely, Bobby Sullivan carried within his memory the solution to 1,000 mechanical puzzles, the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent in service to the art of making machines perform beyond their theoretical limitations. The grid formation began with the familiar ritual of motorcycles being pushed into position according to their qualifying times. Tyler's bike, which had been silent and broken just hours earlier, now rumbled with contained power as he prepared to take his place in the championship field. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Their season had been saved by a man whose own racing career had ended in tragedy more than 2 decades earlier. "Remember," Marcus said through Tyler's helmet radio as they completed their final system checks, "you've got 30 laps to prove that this old bike and this young rider belong in the championship fight. Bobby Sullivan gave you a second chance. Don't waste it." Tyler nodded inside his helmet, feeling the weight of opportunity and responsibility settling over him like a familiar jacket. The race ahead would determine not only his own future, but would honor the gift of knowledge that Bobby Sullivan had shared with them. In a sport where margins of victory were measured in thousandths of seconds, the difference between success and failure often came down to the accumulated wisdom of those who'd traveled the path before. As the engines around him built toward the crescendo that would signal the start of racing, Tyler offered a silent thanks to the mysterious figure who'd emerged from the shadows of racing history to change everything. The championship race was about to begin. But the story Bobby Sullivan had set in motion was far from over. The checkered flag would fall in just over an hour, but the ripples of recognition were only beginning to spread. Bobby Sullivan found himself drawn back toward Garage 17, despite intending to leave entirely. From the grandstand, he watched Tyler successfully complete pre-race ceremonies and take position on the starting grid. The Yamaha's engine note strong and steady in the Nevada air. The race unfolded like mechanical ballet, with Tyler riding the performance of his life. From 14th on the grid, he methodically worked forward through the field, demonstrating calculated aggression that separated competent riders from championship contenders. Bobby watched with trained eyes, noting how Tyler positioned his motorcycle in traffic, managed tire wear, and conserved energy for critical final laps. "That boy can ride," said a voice beside him. Bobby turned to find an elderly veteran settling onto the bench beside him, weathered hands and clear eyes suggesting he'd worked with machinery. "Yes, he can," Bobby agreed. "Good equipment helps, but you can't teach that racecraft. You sound like you know racing," the veteran observed. Bobby smiled slightly. "I've been around it, 27 laps in." Tyler had moved into second and was pressuring the leader with increasing intensity. Derek Castellano struggled with tire wear, the contrast between preparation and privilege playing out in real time. "Interesting technique," Bobby said, more to himself. "He's setting up the leader for a mistake rather than forcing a dangerous pass." "How can you tell?" the veteran asked. "Watch how he positions coming out of turn 6. He's not trying to get alongside, staying close enough to pressure, but far back to capitalize if the leader makes an error." Smart riding. Tyler's strategy paid off on lap 27. Derek, feeling pressure and defending position, carried too much speed into turn 8 and ran wide. Tyler was perfectly positioned, sliding underneath to take the lead with surgical precision. The crowd erupted, but Bobby experienced complex emotions. Tyler's tactical brilliance reminded him powerfully of Clutch Henderson, who'd possessed the same intuitive racecraft. The comparison was both satisfying and an painful reminder of partnership that grief had ended decades earlier. The final laps played out like a masterclass. Tyler managed his motorcycle with wisdom beyond his years, controlling pace, while competitors struggled with tire wear and fuel consumption. When the checkered flag fell, he'd won by 3 comfortable seconds victory that belied the morning's mechanical crisis. Bobby watched the celebration with emotions he hadn't experienced in decades, feeling something stir that grief had seemingly extinguished permanently. "Hell of a race," the veteran said, rising as spectators filed toward exits. "That boy's got a bright future." Bobby remained seated as crowds flowed around him, held by something more complex than satisfaction at problem solved. The morning's events had awakened feelings he'd spent decades suppressing: deep satisfaction of mechanical mastery, joy of helping young talent achieve potential, sense of belonging to something larger than individual existence. His rarely used phone buzzed with surprising message from Marcus Rodriguez. "Bobby, we know who you are now. Thank you doesn't seem enough. Would you consider joining Victory Celebration? Crew would be honored to meet you properly. Marcus. The invitation hung like bridge between past and present, offering connection to world he'd voluntarily abandoned. Bobby stared at the message for minutes, feeling weight of choice settling over him. Below in the infield, Tyler was being interviewed by racing media. When asked about morning's mechanical problems, Tyler paused and looked toward the grandstands, as if knowing Bobby watched. "We had help from unexpected source," Tyler said into microphone. "Sometimes most important assistance comes from people you'd never expect, and wisdom doesn't always wear uniform you think it should." The words carried across Speedway with perfect clarity, settling into Bobby's consciousness like final piece of complex puzzle clicking into place. For over 2 decades, he'd carried weight of loss and withdrawal, believing his purpose died with Clutch Henderson on that Wisconsin practice track. But sitting in Nevada grandstand, watching young riders celebrate championship, made possible by accumulated knowledge, Bobby began understanding that wisdom was meant for sharing, not isolation hoarding. Skills developed over 47 years weren't just personal accomplishments, they were tools serving others, bridges between experience and aspirations. His fingers moved over phone keypad with same deliberate precision shown while repairing Tyler's motorcycle that morning. The reply was brief, but carried weight of life-changing decision. "On my way." As Bobby Sullivan rose and began making his way toward Victory Celebration, he carried not just satisfaction of problem solved, but recognition that his story was far from over. Morning's mechanical crises had been resolved with electrical tape and experience, but human connection it initiated was just beginning to reveal true complexity and potential. The championship trophy would be Tyler's, but real victory belonged to all. Proof that wisdom, skill, and human decency could bridge any gap, whether measured in years, social position, or simple failure to recognize greatness arriving without fanfare. The Victory Celebration in the Speedway's infield buzzed with reporters and racing personnel as Bobby Sullivan made his way through the crowd. His simple work clothes contrasted sharply with the colorful team uniform surrounding him, yet his presence seemed to draw subtle attention. Marcus Rodriguez spotted him first, breaking away from track officials to intercept Bobby with obvious excitement and embarrassment. "Mr. Sullivan," Marcus said, extending his hand with profound respect. "I can't believe you actually came. After this morning... Single quotes, you had a problem that needed solving," Bobby replied quietly. "I was glad I could help." Danny approached with the awkward enthusiasm of someone meeting a legend. "Sir, I owe you an apology. When I called you Pops this morning, I had no idea who you were." Bobby waved away the apology with a gentle smile. "Son, you were protecting your team under pressure." "Nothing wrong with that." Tyler approached, carrying his championship trophy, still in racing leathers. Bobby Sullivan, the engine whisperer himself. "I still can't believe this morning happened." "Believe it," Bobby replied, accepting Tyler's handshake. "And congratulations on brilliant racecraft. That pass for the lead was textbook. Your friend Clutch would have been proud." The casual mention of Clutch Henderson created surprised silence, recognizing that Bobby spoke from personal knowledge rather than research. "You knew Clutch Henderson personally?" Marcus asked respectfully. Bobby's expression grew contemplative, touched with familial sadness. "Clutch and I raced together 27 years. Started as competitors, became closer than brothers. His death changed everything for me." "Is that why you left racing?" Tyler asked quietly. Bobby nodded. "Couldn't find joy in it anymore. Every track, every garage reminded me of what I'd lost. So I walked away completely, sold everything, and tried to forget racing existed. But you came back, Steve observed nervously. Today wasn't supposed to happen, Bobby admitted with a slight smile. I bought a ticket, thinking maybe I could remember what it used to feel like to love this sport. Then I heard your bike struggling, and ... Old habits. Marcus stepped closer, recognizing opportunity. Bobby, what are your plans now? Would you consider getting back into racing somehow? The question hung heavy with possibility. Bobby looked around, to Tyler glowing with victory, at crew members who'd gone from dismissal to respect, at Marcus, whose experienced eye recognized potential. I'm not sure, Bobby said honestly. This morning was the first time in 23 years I'd worked on a race bike. I'd forgotten how good it felt to solve a problem that really mattered. Tyler leaned forward. Trophy forgotten. What if it wasn't just one morning? What if it could be ongoing? What are you suggesting? Maybe we found each other for a reason, Tyler said, gaining momentum. You've got knowledge money can't buy. We've got youth, ambition, and hunger to improve. Maybe those things could work together. Marcus nodded enthusiastically. Tyler's right. There's no substitute for your kind of experience, not just technical knowledge, but racecraft, strategy, understanding how pieces fit together. Bobby felt something stern, not the sharp pain of grief that had defined his relationship with racing for decades, but something warmer, more hopeful. Looking at Tyler's eager face, the crew's respectful attention, the trophy representing dreams achieved through perseverance, he saw possibilities beyond morning's crises. It wouldn't be the same, he said carefully. I'm not the same person I was 23 years ago. That's exactly why we need you, Tyler replied. Racing's gotten so focused on technology, we lose sight of fundamentals. You represent something that can't be programmed or bought. Danny found his voice. Mr. Sullivan, would you teach us what you know? The request carried such genuine humility that Bobby's resistance crumbled. These weren't arrogant professionals demanding knowledge. They were craftsmen recognizing mastery and asking to learn. Teaching is different from doing, Bobby said. Are you sure you want to learn from someone out of the game 20 years? We're sure, Marcus said without hesitation. This morning proved good problem solving doesn't expire. Experience like yours is timeless. As Bobby considered the offer, he thought about Clutch Henderson and conversations about legacy. His friend often said the most important races weren't ones you won yourself, but ones you made possible for others. Perhaps this represented a chance to honor that philosophy, transforming accumulated knowledge into something serving the next generation. If I were to consider this, Bobby said slowly, it would have to be right for everyone. I won't compromise on safety or integrity. And I won't work with people unwilling to learn. We're looking for a mentor, not a miracle worker, Tyler said immediately. Someone to help us get better at all racing aspects. The handshake agreement that followed was built on mutual respect and shared passion for a sport that had brought them together through unpredictable circumstances. As celebration continued, a desert sun descended toward western mountains. Bobby Sullivan found himself rejoining a world he'd thought he'd left forever. The pain of losing Clutch would always be part of his story, but no longer had to be the end of it. The championship trophy would go home with Tyler Brennan. But the real victory belonged to all of them. Proof that wisdom shared multiplies rather than diminishes. And sometimes the most important races bring us back where we belong. 6 months after Riverside Speedway, Garage 17 had transformed into something bridging cutting-edge technology and time-tested craftsmanship. Racing trophies shared shelf space with worn hand tools, while the atmosphere had evolved from frantic urgency to focused competence. The difference between reacting to problems and anticipating them. Bobby Sullivan stood beside Tyler Brennan's latest Yamaha, his grey hair slightly longer, work shirts now bearing the Brennan Racing logo. But his essential nature unchanged, quiet authority built on comprehensive knowledge and experience. "Tell me what you hear," Bobby said to Danny Morrison, who had evolved from enthusiastic 22-year-old into a skilled mechanic capable of diagnosing problems through sound alone. Danny closed his eyes, tilting his head, a gesture learned from Bobby. "The intake resonance is slightly off. Air filter needs cleaning. Also, faint irregularity in valve timing. Check cam chain tensioner soon." Bobby nodded approvingly. 6 months ago, you'd have needed computer diagnostics. Now you're hearing things machines can't measure. Real progress. The transformation extended beyond Danny. Jake had developed supernatural ability to identify bearing problems by feel, while Steve integrated electronic expertise with mechanical intuition. Marcus had evolved from authority-based management into teaching through shared knowledge. Tyler entered carrying coffee, wearing the relaxed confidence of someone who'd won 4 of 6 recent races. Success hadn't changed his character, but given him security to focus on long-term development rather than survival. "How's she looking?" Tyler asked, approaching his motorcycle with familiar reverence. "Solid," Bobby replied. "Danny caught maintenance items we'll address this afternoon. Nothing affecting practice, but good to stay ahead." Marcus approached with technical documents. "Bobby, you were right about gear ratios. Your suggested changes picked up 0.2 per lap in Sector 3. Bobby studied the data with interest. Though his approach differed from computer-driven methodologies, where others saw numbers, he saw the story of machine and rider working together. "The numbers confirm what Tyler felt," Bobby said. "Sometimes the most important data comes from the rider's feedback. No computer replaces that." This integration of mechanical knowledge with modern analysis had become Brennan Racing's signature. Other teams marveled at their consistent improvements, not understanding the secret lay in marrying experience with innovation. Derek Castellano entered, his Redline Racing team struggling to match Brennan's consistency since Bobby's arrival. He approached with carefully casual manner, designer apparel unable to disguise frustration at being outperformed by a team with fraction of his budget. "Heard you guys have been doing interesting development work," Derek said, forcing politeness. "Just staying competitive," Tyler replied diplomatically. Though everyone understood, competitive had become dominating the standings. Derek's gaze swept the garage's unusual combination of high-tech equipment and vintage tools, lingering on Bobby with particular attention of someone trying to decode a confounding puzzle. "Very impressive results, Mr. Sullivan," Derek said with forced respect, wanting access to knowledge that couldn't be purchased. "Experience helps," Bobby replied simply. "Every team finds its own way." After Derek departed frustrated, Marcus gathered the crew for pre-practice briefing. These had evolved into something unique, part technical discussion, part philosophical exploration of human-machine relationships. "Bobby thinks there's performance available in suspension settings," Marcus began. "The bike wants to be more aggressive in fast corners," Bobby explained patiently. "We can give it what it's asking for without compromising stability. It's about listening to machine needs and finding ways to provide them." Danny raised his hand eagerly. "How do you know what the bike is asking for?" Bobby smiled, recognizing curiosity that had driven his own learning. It's like learning language. Every vibration, sound, handling change is communication. Tyler describes feelings. We translate into mechanical adjustments addressing underlying causes. Pattern recognition, Steve added. Bobby taught me to connect seemingly unrelated symptoms. Sometimes handling problems are caused by engine or transmission issues. Tyler nodded enthusiastically. 6 months ago, I'd say bike feels weird and hope someone figured it out. Now I can describe exactly what's happening. Bobby taught us all to speak the same language. As crew dispersed for preparations, Bobby reflected on the journey from grief-stricken retirement to renewed purpose. That morning at Riverside had changed everything, not just Tyler's championship hopes, but his own understanding of meaningful life. Working with Brennan Racing had reawakened his passion while providing something new: satisfaction of teaching, watching young professionals develop skills they'd carry forward. It was different legacy than trophies and wins, but felt more substantial and enduring. Tyler approached carrying his helmet. Bobby, thanks again for taking a chance on us. I know coming back wasn't easy. Bobby accepted gratitude gracefully. Tyler, you gave me something I didn't know I was missing: reason to care about racing again. Clutch always said the most important races are ones you make possible for others. I finally understand. As Tyler headed toward his motorcycle and crew completed preparations, Bobby stood in the garage that had become his second home, surrounded by tools, sounds, and relationships giving his life new meaning. Championship trophies represented past achievements, but knowledge being shared pointed toward future possibilities none could yet imagine. Tyler's Yamaha fired to life with crisp, powerful voice that had become soundtrack of their success. The sound echoed like a promise: excellence was possible, dreams could survive disappointment, and profound victories often lifted everyone toward unreachable heights alone. As Bobby listened to Mechanical Symphony, he heard echoes of every engine he'd worked on, every problem solved, every young professional developed. Most clearly, he heard Clutch Henderson's voice, no longer source of pain, but reminder that the best way to honor those lost is passing forward knowledge they helped us gain. The championship season lay ahead, full of unpredictable challenges and opportunities. Whatever came next, they'd face it together, mentor and student. Experience and ambition, wisdom and determination, united in pursuit of something transcending individual achievement and approaching art. The garage door rolled open to reveal a perfect racing day, bright with possibility and rich with promise. Asterisk, what an incredible journey we've shared. From Bobby's quiet observation to his triumphant return to racing, we've witnessed second chances, hidden wisdom, and human connections, transformative power. Asterisk. This tale reminds us that profound help comes from unexpected sources, and age often disguises depths of knowledge money can't buy. If this moved you, if it reminded you that greatness hides in plain sight and everyone deserves second chances, please like and share this story. Your comments about resonant moments help create community believing in human potential and recognizing value wherever found. Asterisk. Subscribe for more stories celebrating extraordinary qualities within ordinary people, because the next Bobby Sullivan might be waiting quietly in your life, ready to change everything if someone has wisdom to listen. Asterisk.